This is Aesthetically Trained, the podcast. Pushing you to year-on-year progression. With your host, Ross McKinley.
Yo, Ross McKinley, Aesthetically Trained, the podcast, episode 4. Today's podcast is going to be short and sweet. I wanted to give you an introduction to training, an overview of training, the basics, the key terms that you need to know, and give you a brief insight into what I think about progressive overload, hypertrophy, high volume, low volume, and for starters, what the fuck even are those terms? So whether you're a beginner, intermediate, advanced, I'll be giving you tips on what your next training program should look like, what your current one actually is, and how to work out to get the best results moving forward. So, to start, where do I start with it all? Well, why are we actually training? What is the goal of training? The first thing I want to say, and I mentioned this in the UK and for everyone over the world, I guess, is during lockdown, we had this obsession with exercising, with working out. People like Joe Wicks, general fitness, exercising for exercising's sake. That's great, but what I encourage, what I want all of you to do, we're not just working out, we're not just going to the gym and fucking about. Even if you're trained at home, your training needs a purpose. We need a goal. We're training to get a specific result. We're training to build our physiques. We're training, and this is the key word, to stimulate hypertrophy. Whether you're a beginner, intermediate, advanced, whatever level you're at, however many years you've had in the gym, whatever your training age is, which is how many years you've been training properly, all of us are training for that one goal, to stimulate hypertrophy. What is hypertrophy? Some of you might have heard the term before. You'll hear PTs throwing it about all over the place, but hypertrophy is basically the increase in the size or the increase in the cross-sectional area of the muscle fiber. And that is due to a stimulus created or caused or built up by our training programs. And every time you go into the gym, your goal, keep it in mind, for aesthetics, to look your best, whether you're a middle-aged bloke who's looking to lose weight and improve their posture, whether you're a young lad who's looking to build as much muscle as possible, both people, everyone needs more and is trying to stimulate muscular hypertrophy. Alongside that, there's obviously dietary considerations, which we're going to consider in future episodes. But the main focus of today's episode is this, is hypertrophy, is how to stimulate hypertrophy and how to get the most out of your sessions. So now we know what hypertrophy is. That's our goal when we're going to the gym. How does your training program do it? Well, the first question is do you even have a fucking training program? Because the likelihood is if you don't, you're missing out on what are known as the mechanisms of hypertrophy. You might be muddling your way through training. You might be fluking it or training hard or just simply putting more weight on the bar, which is progressive overload. We'll get to that later. But to get the most out of your training, you're getting the theme with this podcast. It's about getting the most out of everything, your time, your life, everything. And for training, we need to at least consider or be aware of these mechanisms. So in very basic terms, hypertrophy is the goal of training. That's why we lift weights. It's to create enough of a stimulus to incur muscle damage, to put stress on the muscle, which causes a response from the body due to adaptation, which means that the muscle grows. That's what we're doing whenever we're in the gym. The reason that we need to do it in a fat loss phase and in a muscle building phase, then in a muscle building phase, we're trying to build muscle. And in a fat loss phase, we're trying to retain the muscle mass that we've already got, improve our posture and everything else along the way. Get stronger, get fitter. We want those adaptations to occur. But what are the mechanisms of those adaptations? I'm not expecting everyone to go to university to get their degree. You don't even need that for this stuff. I'm not expecting you to even Google what these things are. But just being aware of them and how they link into your training will give you a basis. So, the mechanisms of hypertrophy are mechanical tension, that's the first one. Metabolic stress or cellular swelling, kind of the same thing, that's why I give them two names. Some people refer to them differently. And then the third one is muscle damage. So I'm going to run over them again and give you a little bit of a brief insight into what they are. The first one, mechanical tension. That's probably the most well-known or popular term in terms of it's basically about putting as much weight, not necessarily on the bar, but the most weight and tension on the muscle. That means what exercises place the most stress and muscular and mechanical tension on the muscle. For example, you might be able to squat really heavy. You might be able to deadlift really heavy. A good example is bench press. You might be able to load 100 kilos or whatever it is on bench. But it doesn't necessarily mean that's the best exercise mechanical tension. That could just be the best exercise for powerlifting or for showing your strength. But mechanical tension is about maintaining the stress on the muscle throughout the rep. So keeping that in mind, this is why it's important. For bodybuilding, for aesthetics, it's making sure that we maintain mechanical tension throughout a rep. That means that when you're training, if a goal is mechanical tension, you can't move the weight from A to B very controlled. Those of you listening, I'm moving my arm now to try to show a controlled motion. You can't consider coaching cues, tempo, how to perform the movement properly, and squeeze your chest on every rep or whatever exercise is and think about the muscle lengthening and contracting and really keep the tension on that muscle and squeezing whilst going heavy. And then all of a sudden, when you get to what's called your top sets or your biggest sets or your challenge or whatever it is, then all of a sudden abandon that form and technique. Because if mechanical tension is one of the main drivers of hypertrophy and we lose mechanical tension or abandon it just to increase weight or just for our ego, we're actually losing the very stimulus that we need, or we're not getting the most out of it. So the first one is mechanical tension. And like I said, it's essentially the exercises or placing the muscle under the most stress possible using exercises that fit your physique, your current ability level, and keep the tension on the muscle through the full working range. It also means that you're using a weight that you can control, contract, and power up, if you like, through that rep range. Does that make sense? Your next one is metabolic stress, or some people call it cellular swelling as well. You might have heard it referred to as that. And that's more your classic bodybuilding stuff. That's getting a pump. That's getting an accumulation of blood in and around the muscle, which causes, if you like, a pump. It gives you an increase in the nutrients in the area that you're training because the blood obviously is carrying your nutrients, if you like. That could be trisets, which is when you do 3 exercises back to back. It could be supersets. It could be having less rest time in between sets so that you're working harder. Could be blood flow restriction. There's loads of ways to stimulate or to accumulate volume and create metabolic stress. The more the classic, the fun stuff, the thing that makes you look good in the mirror. It's not necessarily the stuff where you're lifting the heaviest weight. It's not the stuff that you're dreading doing. It's maybe the pump sets at the end. But they are important because they're another way to make we grow. And then the last one is muscle damage. And muscle damage is really an accumulation of the first two in the overall volume of your workout. Plus, it can be loaded eccentrics, weighted stretches. It's a combination of everything. That's why some programs might have specific tempos, which means the speed that you move the weight. They might have a 4-second eccentric phase where you're lowering the weight slowly over 4 seconds. That's because it increases the time under tension, which is good for mechanical tension. Theoretically, that would also help with metabolic stress. But then also the eccentric, the lowering phase being slow, maybe he's pausing in the bottom under a stretch with load, that will also increase muscle damage, which will therefore lead into hypertrophy. So in every workout, that's a very brief summary, but we're going to cover these in upcoming episodes, so I wanted to talk about them now so that you're not completely going in blind. In every workout, you should look or you should be aware of these mechanisms and how you stimulate them. This is why you don't do, or you shouldn't be doing, 5 sets of 5 for every single exercise. It's why you don't do 3 sets of 12 for everything. It's why you need a varied workout in terms of sets and reps, the tempos that you use, the rest times that you have, and the methods that you use in terms of supersets, trisets, straight sets, drop sets, rest pause. Some of that might not make any sense to you yet, but it will over the coming months and years that this podcast lasts. But they're your mechanisms essentially. They're your tick boxes in every session. They're the things that you think, right, I've done a heavy set, I've trained to failure, I could feel it on my chest all the way through. That's my mechanical tension rate. That's my heavy set. That's my progressive overload, which we're going to get later in the episode. And then you might do some pump work. You might do a tricep where you're hammering your biceps from all different angles. That's your metabolic stress. In fact, I'll give you an example. Let's do chest. I'm going to just show you three different mechanisms or 3 different ways to stimulate those 3 things. And then you can think for the next time you go in the gym, how are you doing it for each body part? You don't necessarily need to do it for every body part or each body part in every session, but over your training split across the week, you should do. As well as the working range or the range of the muscle, if you like, you should be considering these things. So for chest, mechanical tension, I would actually probably say a dumbbell chest press. Most people get better contraction in that chest. Maybe it's a plate loaded chest press machine. That would be your mechanical tension. You might do 2 heavy sets of 6 to 8. You'll go to failure, whatever the rep range is, but you're probably going to go a little bit heavier and you're going to go to failure on that. Your metabolic stress, your pump work, might be a cable fly. You're working it through a full range. You're concentrating on driving your elbows in. You're really thinking about, now the muscle's got blood in it, you're thinking about contracting, you're thinking about squeezing, you're thinking about high rep work with minimal rest. You might do a cable fly supersetted with a press up, for example. And then your last one, to create more muscle damage and maybe even look at some imbalances, you might finish off with a single arm pec deck. You're really working the range, you're using a slow eccentric, you're counting the reps back, you're going back over 4 seconds, you might do 12 reps with a 4-second lowering phase, and you hold it for 2 seconds when the muscle's fully stretched, which will increase the muscle damage, which places under a loaded stretch, which is something I mentioned before. You're going to do 12 reps on each side. So by doing those 3 things for chest, we've hit mechanical tension, we've got a pump and hit metabolic stress, then we've done muscle damage, and also in that, because I'm fucking good and I've helped you, you've even done some unilateral work, so you've helped to iron out any imbalances that you may have in the muscle. Now, one of the other things I mentioned there, and I'm going to try to just touch on everything in this episode, and then hopefully following your questions, we can follow up with more specific episodes moving forward. One of the other things that I mentioned, 2 things I'm going to talk about, is volume and progressive overload. So what is volume? I remember we're not talking about the sound on this podcast. We're talking about sets and reps. Total weight lifted is how some people look at it, or sets and reps is your other one. Sets and reps is probably a little bit easier, looking at the total sets that you do. For example, you might train chest on a Monday, International Chest Day Monday, let's get it. You might do 15 sets of chest on a Monday. You count the total number of sets in each exercise, and that's your total volume for that session. You then might also do chest on a Tuesday or on a Thursday later in the week and do 10 sets in that session, which would mean across your week, you're doing 25 sets of chest. That's your total volume. Another way of measuring it would be looking at your total weight lifted. That's probably a little bit more complicated, and what you'd be doing there is looking at the kilograms that you lift on every machine or on every stack or on every rep and adding that up and looking at the total volume in your session that way. One of the discussions that we'll have moving forward is what's a better training program, high volume versus low volume. You might have heard of that before. What that basically means is what training techniques are you using? What methods do you favor? And the general school of thought is, or what some people tend to go with, is you're either high volume, which is a lot of sets and reps, more volume. So it means you might be doing 4 sets, 3 sets, 5 sets of 12, 15. You'll still get some low rep range in, but you'll be doing a lot of volume. Means that for beginners, you're getting a lot of practice of exercise, essentially. Then there's the other camp, the other school of thought, that low volume is better. That tends to be people who more think that you should train hard, but do less sets and reps. I'm going to give you some questions at the end on that and give you my insight before we go. So that's your volume. Your next one, this is one of my favorite things to talk about. Progressive overload. All of this, everything that we're doing, we need progressive overload. We need to be making progress. We need to be trying to improve each week. Because when we're looking at hypertrophy, when we're looking at improving, we've got specificity, which is the exercise is what we're targeting. Therefore, if you're training chest, your chest's going to improve. You've got adaptation, which is the body will adapt to the stimulus that it's given. You've got reversibility, which means if you stop training, the muscle will return, the hypertrophy will reverse, which is called atrophy. You might have heard of that before. And the other one, any science nerds out there will be like, he's missed overload. It's because I'm saying it last. And the other one is overload, which means that because of adaptation, because of specificity, means that if we're hitting our chest every week or whatever we're doing, every time we do that workout, our body adapts. We need to overload, we need to progress, we need to place more stress on the muscles, tendons, joints, muscles mainly, if you like. We need to increase the difficulty of the exercises and of the session. And to do that, progressive overload, you're probably thinking, well, it just means weights. A common question is, should I drop the weight to get the reps? Should I stay with it and fail? Well, this will hopefully answer that. Progressive overload isn't just adding weight to the bar. Let's get clear on that. It's possibly adding weight to the bar, and that can be as small as 1.25 each time, but it's about an overall improvement. It's about looking at the factors, looking at what you've got in your session in terms of your sets and reps, your weight on the bar, the tempo, the rest time, the frequency across the week. So when are you actually training? So you might decide that you want to improve progressive overload or add more sets in for chest. It doesn't necessarily have to be in that chest session. You might add another chest session in later in the week, which adds to total volume. So progressive overload is essentially an improvement in one of the areas that you're tracking. So if you can't add weight to the bar on your bench press, on your plate loaded press, chest is the easiest one to use, isn't it? Because everyone loves training chest. If you can't add weight to the bar, what else could you do? You could try and get one more rep every week. You could make sure that you're sticking at the same rest time when you do that. You could maybe, if you can't do any more reps or weight in that set that you've prescribed yourself, let's say you're doing 4 sets of 8 reps. And on the 4th set, you try to put the weight up, but you can't, there's nothing left, you fail at 8 reps. You're like, fuck, I haven't improved. I haven't added weight and I haven't gained any reps. You could do another set. You could do a 5th set at a little bit less weight and you could rep it out. You could do some partials, some partial range of motion reps. You could do some of the things I mentioned before. We could add in some weighted stretches. There's loads of ways. But initially, beginners, a lot of people tend to think they have to be adding weight to the bar. Key thing here, if you take one thing from the podcast, make sure it's this. You should have a training program. But any good training program has coaching cues, has specific techniques or ways that they want you to perform the movement. That means if you're training chest, if you're training legs, whatever exercise it is, you should know what tempo you're doing, which is the way that you move the weight. That's the lowering phase, the pause in the bottom, the contraction phase or the up, and the flex or the hold at the top. Progressive overload isn't progressive overload at all costs. It's progressive overload whilst maintaining all the other variables. That means that you're resting for roughly the same amount of time. I don't mind if sometimes you have an extra 30 seconds rest if you really need it. But it means most importantly that the coaching cues are the same. It means that when you're bench pressing, if for the last 3 weeks you've been lowering over 3 seconds, pausing it for a second on your chest, then banging it up and exploding up, it doesn't mean that this week, because you're struggling and you really want to add 1.25 or 2.5 kilos to the bar, you want to get one more rep, you're not meant to break from that cycle. You're not meant to say, fuck it, I'm not going to do time under tension. I'm not going to control the weight down anymore. I'm going to change what I'm doing. So you need to make sure that you're focusing on that. Does that make sense? Is that right? Does everyone understand? So that is your very brief introduction. I wanted to keep this simple today so that everyone can take something from it and hopefully just be more aware of the terms moving forward. The last thing I want to say to you, whether you're beginner, intermediate or advanced, I want you to think about your current training program. I want you to think about what I've just said and imagine, am I applying progressive overload based on what Ross has just said? That's your first question. Am I applying progressive overload? And the next one I want to know is, what training program, what style of training program do you think you're covering now? Do you think you're high volume? Do you think you're low volume? And then just have a brief think. Try to implement what I've said about the mechanisms of hypertrophy. Try to just think, where am I doing that? And in your next session, think, how can I create more demand? How can I create even more of a stimulus for hypertrophy? Am I missing out one of the 3 mechanisms? Am I not doing some pump work? Am I not thinking about eccentrics and the overall muscle damage and volume of the session? Am I only doing mechanical tension? Am I missing the heavy loaded sets where I'm placing stress on the muscle, which is mechanical tension? Have a think, be more present in the process. We're going to be talking about this a lot in the podcast over the coming months, but that is your introduction to the mechanisms of hypertrophy, what you need to know for training, progressive overload. Let us know what you think. Thank you.
You've been listening to Aesthetically Trained, the podcast. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and spread the word.